Thank you for joining us, everyone. We'll be starting in a few minutes. Good morning to everyone who's logging in. We'll be starting in a couple of minutes, and if you want to take a moment to say hello in the chat and let us know where you are logging in from, that would be great. Good morning and aloha. I think we'll probably have people continue to log in, but we'll get started. So aloha, everyone. Welcome. My name is Andrea Nandoskar. I'm the Education Program Manager at Historic Hawai Foundation. I want to thank you for joining us for today's online seminar on identifying and documenting character-defining features. I'm assisted today behind the scenes by my colleague, Michelle Kisek, and HHF's Executive Director, Kirsten Faulkner, will be presenting a portion of today's program. This presentation is a co-production with the Department of the Interior's National Park Service. Just to share a little, for those who may not know about Historic Hawai Foundation, we're a statewide nonprofit dedicated to preserving the historic buildings, sites, communities, and structures that tell the unique stories of Hawaii's multi-layered history. We were founded in 1974, and HHF has become the driving force behind historic preservation in the state through its core programs of developing a community ethic of historic preservation, supporting smart legislation, offering educational events and training for local communities, and providing technical assistance to make preservation accessible. HHF essentially helps people save historic places. We are joined today by Dr. Elaine Jackson-Rajando, who is the Preservation Partnerships and History Program Manager for the National Park Service's region that includes Hawaii. She joins us from California. The National Park Service preserves unimpaired the natural and cultural resources and values of the national park system for the enjoyment, education, and inspiration of this and future generations. The Park Service cooperates with partners to extend the benefits of natural and cultural resource conservation and outdoor recreation throughout this country and the world. The seminar has been approved by the American Planning Association for certificate maintenance credits for AICP through the co-sponsorship and partnership with the APA Hawaii chapter. We thank APA Hawaii for supporting continuing education for planning professionals. The seminar has been approved for the American Institute of Architects, AIA, for 1.5 AIA CES. Architects seeking credit will need to enter their name and AIA number in the post-event survey that will come up on a separate webpage after the webinar ends. The training today will present an overview of a methodology that can be used to identify those materials, features, and spaces that contribute to the visual character of a building or historic property. These character-defining features form the basis of the preservation plan and selected treatments. Regional styles and adaptations specific to Hawaii will be highlighted. Today's seminar will be about 90 minutes, and the first portion is a presentation about the general concepts, which will be followed by audience questions. Please submit your questions via the chat function as we go, and we'll answer as many as we can in the time that we have. During the presentation, we will also have a few knowledge checks with our audience. These will be pop-up boxes on the screen, and we will ask all the participants to click on the best answer. We'll give it a few moments and then we'll share the results. The answers are aggregated and anonymous. We do not connect to a virtual audience since we can't see you, so this is a way to just make sure that you're there and that you're connected to what we're sharing. And let's try now with a general question. Okay, one second. Okay, so please indicate your affiliation or primary interest in today's topic, and you can select all that apply for you. And we'll just give it a little bit of time and then take a look at the results. You can see everybody is speaking up. Great, okay. I'm gonna stop and share results. Got a few more. Okay, so it looks like we have a cross-section of people. The highest is land use professionals. That's interesting. Planners, architects, landscape architects. And we have people from the state government, Native Hawaiian organizations, public or community interest, property owners. So we have a great cross-section. Thank you so much. And now I would like to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Elaine Jackson-Rotondo. Thank you, Elaine.
Hello, Andrea. Good morning, good afternoon. Our discussion of character-defining features today is, excuse me, obviously within a broader context of historic preservation and the treatment of historic properties. And in this case, we're going to focus on buildings and landscapes. Next slide. The best practices for the treatment of historic properties recommended in the Secretary of the Interior Standards and Guidelines all start with the same first step, regardless of whether your selected treatment is preservation, rehabilitation, restoration, or reconstruction. That first step is identifying character-defining features, followed by retaining and preserving them so that the overall historic character of the property continues to exist. Today, we're focused on identifying character-defining features in not the Secretary of the Interior standards and guidelines. However, we covered the standards in a module last year, which is available online. And you can also visit the National Park Service Technical Preservation Services website, where you can view and download copies of the Secretary of the Interior standards and guidelines. Within the context of historic preservation and the Secretary of the Interior standards, character is based in the tangible and refers to all those visual and spatial aspects and physical elements that comprise the appearance of a historic building or landscape. Character-defining features include overall form or shape of a building, materials, craftsmanship, decorative details, as well as interior spaces and the overall setting and environment. And for landscapes, the characteristics can include natural systems, features, topography, circulation, vegetation, buildings and structures, and other small scale features. Even if a building or landscape may be historically rather than architecturally significant, the tangible elements are the material connection to the significance associated with the specific events or persons. And it is those character defining tangible elements, both on the exterior and interior, that should be preserved. I want to note that while identification of character defining features is based in the tangible elements of a property, having knowledge about the property prior to identifying character defining features can be helpful. And if you think about it, it would be pretty rare that someone would be identifying and documenting character defining features of a property for which they have no knowledge. The purpose of documenting what is character defining in a building or landscape is so that those features or elements that give the building or landscape its visual character can be taken into account in order to preserve them. If the various materials, features, and spaces that give a building its visual character are not recognized and preserved, then essential aspects of its character may be damaged or lost in the process of either managing, maintaining, or changing that resource. A building's, we can go back, that would be good, one slide. A building or landscape's character can be irreversibly damaged or changed in many ways. For example, the removal of a lanai, using mortar on the face of a dry stack wall, insensitive changes to a window sash, or changes to the setting around the building, or removal of historic vegetation in a landscape. Next slide. Documenting character defining features does not in and of itself tell someone how to treat a historic building or landscape. It is a starting point for selecting and implementing treatment that is also informed by the condition, material, significance, period of significance, as well as the use or proposed use of the property. It is information that is incorporated into preservation plans, and historic structures reports or cultural landscape reports, as well as other treatment and maintenance plans or documents aimed at good preservation practice. Now it's time for a knowledge check. A nonprofit, I'll read the question out loud. A nonprofit board just acquired a historic house that they want to use as an office. Board member A suggests they hire an architect straight away to draw up some plans. Board member B suggests that first hire someone to identify the character defining features of the property and develop a historic structures report. Whose suggestion is more aligned with best preservation practice? Board member A or board member B? I'll give you just a couple of seconds. I make it sound 2 seconds. I'll give you a few seconds to log your answer, and then we can show the results. These are not intended to be mind-blowing questions, just to highlight some points as we go along. 100%. Oh, wow. I'm very pleased about that. Next slide. First, if you don't identify the character defining features in advance, you're at a disadvantage. The board would be at a disadvantage when they interact with the architect, and knowing, what might be the best design for what it is they're trying to achieve. So, for buildings, there's an easy 3-step approach for identifying character defining features, starting by looking at a building from afar, then going to a closer or kind of arm length range, and then moving on to the interior. For landscapes, there is a similar scaled or scope of vision approach to identifying character defining landscape characteristics. The National Park Service Cultural Landscape Program recognizes 13 landscape characteristics that might be present in a property. And it starts at the largest scale of natural systems and features down to the level of small scale features. We will dive into the three-step approach for buildings after we take a closer look at some landscape characteristics through a specific example. In this case, the Makalapa Navy Housing Historic District at Pearl Harbor. First, I want to provide some background information about the historic property. The district, next slide. The district is listed on the National Register under Criterion 1 for its association with events connected to the Navy's preparations for World War II. Also significant under Criterion B for its association with Admiral Nimitz, who resided there and directed the U.S. Navy operations in the war. And Criterion C for its neighborhood design and groundbreaking construction techniques and architectural design. The period of significance for the property is 1940 to 1945. Next slide. The natural systems and features present in the Makalapa housing area include the crater, which you can see in the slide in the upper. Yes, that's being pointed to, as well as the sloping land from that the outside edge or rim of the crater, and then Pearl Harbor itself, which you can't see in the this image, but would be out to kind of the bottom right, and then also maybe to a lesser degree the Halava Stream. Next slide. The topography of the area is character defining throughout the historic district, and it informed the overall planning and layout of the housing area, as well as circulation patterns, as we will see. You can kind of see in the image on the left, the sloping yard down, and then in the image on the right, you have a garage, and you can see the steps coming down the hillside to access the garage. The circulation within the district is curvilinear, following the kind of curvature of the crater, rather than an imposed rectilinear grid approach that really lends a park-like kind of suburban character rather than an urban area characteristic to the housing area. Circulation, when you are looking at a landscape, also includes pedestrian pathways such as walkways. There aren't many walkways in Makalapa, but you can see in the image in the upper right that there is a walkway in that area. But the absence of those walkways is also, a character defining feature. Related to both the circulation and topography of the property is spatial organizations. It may be a little bit difficult to see in this image, however, I think you can make out the presence of open spaces in the far right of that boundary, where it says, yes, exactly there. And then within the center of that area, you have clusters of buildings and clusters of buildings along the roadways. Next, this is zooming in a little closer to the area to allow you to see a little bit better how the buildings are clustered as you're walking through the site versus experiencing that cluster in plan. It's just an illustration of that organization. And then you have vegetation. In the case of Makalapa, the vegetation is very character defining, very mature vegetation, but in addition to the maturity of the vegetation, the placement of it is rather informal. You don't have large areas of trees that are, aligned, or an alley of trees. It's more informal, and it gives and adds to that park-like character. You can imagine, or you probably have driven through neighborhoods where, there isn't any vegetation or very little vegetation, and you get a very different sense of the character of that landscape. Next slide. And here we're looking at structures and small scale features. And you can see that in this case that the structures, and in this case, mostly structures, but you could also consider the steps and the rail as a small scale feature, that they're functional, or, they're really accommodation to the topography and natural systems present on the site. But you would want to identify these through, as you were documenting or assessing the character defining features of this landscape, because they really do add to how you experience the landscape, the walls, the steps that you use to go from one level to another. But I also want to I wanted to just really quickly highlight other types of small scale features that you might find in landscapes before we dive into identifying the character defining features in the building. And this is an image of the Foster Botanical Gardens in Honolulu. And if you look really closely at the left-hand side of the slide, you can see a stone statue of a Buddha. And on the ground, almost off the edge of the image, there is a small scale stone pagoda. And then in the far back there, a little bit to the right of the Buddha, there are some large stones that have been deliberately placed in the landscape. These would be the types of small scale features that you might identify as character defining within this landscape, because they really do contribute to the character of the place. Next slide. As previously mentioned, there's an easy way to approach identification of character defining features of a building. First examine a building from afar to understand its overall setting and identify the overall visual character of a building. Then you move up closer to appreciate its material and the craftsmanship and surface finishes that are evident in these materials. And then going into and through a building's spaces with attention to spatial sequencing, overall layout, and details that comprise its interior visual character. Identifying the overall visual character of a building is really, nothing more than looking at its distinguishing physical aspects without really focusing on those finer details. The major contributors to a building's overall character are embodied in the general aspects of the shape of the building. And we're going to start by looking at 4 elements of character defining features: setting, overall shape of the building, roof and roof features such as chimneys or cupolas, and various projections such as lanai. And we're going to use the example of the Bond Memorial Public Library, located in Kapa'au on Hawaii Island. And so if you look at this slide on the left, and you can see that there's the immediate kind of site, which is flat with the lawn, and that the bigger setting is a treed backdrop or setting. And then as you look at the overall shape of the roof, you can see that it is a gabled roof, looking at the building from the front. And then when you look at the building from the back, you can see that you can see the gable end of another roof, and then It's not clear, right, when you're looking at it, whether that's a shed roof coming out or whether they're intersecting roofs, but you would note those roof features. And then also, as far as projections, if you look very closely in the image on the left, you can see that there's a bay window, a bay area that projects out. And then at the entryway, there's kind of an entry portico. Next slide. Additional character defining features that you would note from afar are recesses or voids in a building, such as open galleries, arcades, or recessed balconies, openings for windows and doorways, and then various exterior materials that contribute to the building's character that you can tell or discern from afar. And then going back to the building, in the image on the right, you can see that there is a porched area. And when you look from afar, it looks like there are window openings behind on the wall, back wall of the porch. And then on the front of the building, you will see that there are also windows on the front, and then the area for the door on the image on the left-hand side. And then in that bay area as well, there are windows. And if you're looking, you can tell that there's wood on the exterior, that it's a wood finish, and it's not clear on the image on the right whether that material on the left-hand side of the image of that right is wood or not, but that's something that you could discern as you move closer to the building. So this is the full list that we just went over of the character defining features that you would note from looking at a building from afar. And this applies to whatever type of building, you know, whether it's the type of building that the smaller building that we just looked at, or a larger building like the Dillingham Transportation Building. Next slide. Moving closer or close up to the building, step 2, it allows you to focus on the details more closely and on the materials of the building. And as you can see, as you zoom in, that there are brackets at the top of the columns or posts for the porch. And you can start to see that there's corrugated metal roof there. I don't know that material was clear from looking at it from afar, but that's something that would be considered character defining. Next. Other details that become more evident is the decorative vent in the gable. And then if you look at the image on the right, at the top, there is kind of a hint of an Aramoya roof profile. And then the decorative lattice, which was already pointed out with the cursor, between the supporting columns of the entry portico. And this is a close-up view of the Dillingham Transportation Building. Not only are you able to see the details in the materials that are character defining, as well as the quality of those materials, including the finish and profiles, etc., but you're also able to get a better sense of the character defining spatial aspects of the portico or the arcade that might not have been apparent to you viewing it from afar. You can see more of the design features as you move closer to the building. And these are just 2 additional character defining features that would be visible from a close-up view of the Dillingham. After you've looked at a property, you know, a building, looking at it from close up, you would go to the interior. And here we have the example of the Hawaii Theater, and then an example from the interior of a house at Makalapa. And as you move into the interior of the building, you're identifying both the spatial and material aspects, as well as any structural elements that may contribute to the overall character of the interior of the building. With the Hawaii Theater, you have the overall theater space, but within that, you also have the main floor area for the audience, the stage, the balcony, and perhaps, I'm not sure with this particular theater whether there is an orchestra pit, but in some theaters there are orchestra pits that would be considered character defining as far as the spatial aspects of the building. With the interior of the home, you have a spatial connection through the stairway and the low wall surrounding the stairway. And I don't know if you can make it out, but there's a window between the bedroom to the hallway above the bookshelf. These two images also illustrate interior features that are part of the building that would be considered character defining. For example, in the Makalapa interior, you have the built-in bookshelf, you have the trellis or decorative panel, open panel at the end of the wall that separates where you kind of first come up into the circulation of the upper floor and go down the hallway. And then within the theater, you have, the alcoves, you have the ceiling dome. There's lots of aspects of this space that are pretty detailed, that are integral to the actual building. There's also railings, etc. Exposed structure can also be character defining in a building. You have on the left-hand side the Dearborn building in Honolulu with the exposed structure, ceiling structure that is very character defining in that large space. And then on the right, this is a wood structure that's exposed, and it's character defining not only in its presence, but it also creates because of it's not a clear span, and you have the columns that are supporting the structure above, that you start to have character defining spatial aspects from that exposed structure. Next, we start to look at distinctive materials and finishes that are character defining for a building. These are pretty ornate and extravagant examples from the Dillingham and from the theater. And you would note them. You wouldn't just say, oh, there's highly decorative features. You would start to identify what are the different aspects of the finishes, the floor, the walls, the ceiling, and you would note them specifically. But in the everyday structures that a lot of people would really be identifying, for which they would be identifying character defining features, they might be more mundane, such as wood paneling, plaster finished walls. I also want to note that materials and finishes include light fixtures, hardware, and even doors. And here are a few examples. The two on the left are from the Alani Palace. You have the door hinge and the door strike that are very unique and ornate. And I would identify those as character defining, something that you would want to preserve. And the two images of the left, these are doors from the Makalapa housing. One door, the first door is into the kitchen. And then in the second door, you can see there's a decorative panel in the center. And then the doors on the right are the elevator doors in the Dillingham building on the interior. I think it's time for another knowledge check. What are some of the overall character defining features of the Palama Fire Station that you can see in this image? A, overall building and roof forms. B, openings for windows and doors. C, the tooling of the mortar joints. D, both A and B. I'll give you a little bit of time to think it over. And we have another 100%. We have an excellent group today. We'll move on to, I mean, obviously, I guess I should go over this a little bit. You know, with the overall building roof forms and openings and for windows and doors, those are obviously viewable, but you know, you wouldn't be until you got closer up that you'd be able to see something as refined as the tooling or other craftsmanship level qualities of the materials and construction of the building. Next slide. Lastly, I just wanted to touch on some of the ways to document or capture the character defining features that you identify. There isn't, you know, any one way that's right or wrong. The key is to capture the information in a form that's understandable and usable. You know, in some ways can include annotated photographs, annotated sketches, or a narrative that has that includes a photograph, or even schedules. And an image on the left, that's a door schedule actually from a National Register nomination that includes both the photograph demonstrating the door, illustrating the door, and then a sketch that shows a little bit more detail that sometimes you can't pick up on in a photo. And then accompanying these visuals, it's not included in this slide. There is a schedule saying where these doors or these door types are located within that building. And then on the right, you have a rather nice sketch with you know, a list of different elements of the building that are character defining, and just, you know, leaders pointing to where those are in that property. Next slide. And I wanted to include this example because this is at the landscape scale in which you're documenting natural systems and landscapes. And don't know that you can read the actual labels there, but it's identifying the poly. This is at Kalaupapa on Molokai, and the Kahuku crater, and then the Waipolu Valley, Waimea Valley, and just all of those features so that it's very clear when you are referring to them exactly where they're located. And now I will turn it over to Kirsten.
Thank you, Elaine. I always enjoy listening to these overviews of how to think about these different places and how to apply a methodology. So thank you for breaking it down for us and giving us this great orientation. One of the things we wanted to do today was talk about some of the regional styles of Hawaii and some of the predominant or common defining characteristics of some of those regional styles. Most people know the architecture of Hawaii evolved, obviously, with the people who settled here and the forms and traditions and cultures that they brought with them. And of course, that's also related to the availability of building materials and influences from other places. So while all types and styles of architecture are present in the islands, there are some types of design and construction that are specifically known for their association with Hawaii. And starting from the oldest and then moving forward in time to the present, you know, we'll start with Native Hawaiian architecture. And this indigenous architecture is really similar in form to that of the Marquesas Islands and other places in Polynesia. So in addition to the actual forms, many of the names of the various structural members can be traced back to earlier Polynesian languages. And like the people who came after them, the early Polynesian immigrants brought their architectural traditions with them. Hawaii's first building and construction was based on the natural surroundings. The hale, which is the house or the structure, really had little to do with the builder. We didn't have, you know, named architects for the most part, but it had more to do with its specific function and the hale's relationship to the natural world. It was very light on the land and purpose built. Building techniques that had been used to develop the va'ar, the canoes, also helped create the simple, efficient, very suitable architecture. Dry stack engineering techniques helped create the heiau that still survive today. And indigenous building materials included rock, grasses, wood, and this helped create sleeping structures and eating hale, as well as more monumental architecture like the heiau. Also for engineering systems like the irrigation systems and the field systems that, again, we still see today. The materials were all gathered locally. There was no importation of materials at this point in time, but most of those materials predate human occupation of the islands. As the voyagers landed, they of course brought different materials with them, but there were others that were indigenous or native to the islands. So this included things like the durable, fragrant peely grass with its long, flat blades, and that was a favored thatching material. The last known example of this form was actually this last grass hut, and this hale was brought to Bishop Museum. It's on display in Hawaiian Hall. And about 2007 or so, there was a restoration project to rethatch it, but you can go and still see that last hale in Hawaiian Hall today. The Hawaiian people built their structures without the use of metals. There's no indigenous metals in Hawaii, and they didn't have the wheel either. So stone adzes formed notches, tenons, forked mortises, and these were bound with lashings. So the olana was a favored material to make cord. Usually the women made the cord and gathered the thatching materials, while men gathered the timbers and constructed the buildings. So some of the common character defining architectural features of this indigenous architecture include stone foundations, the hardwood structures that they're lashed together, the steep gabled walls, or steep gabled roofs. Doors were usually on the side wall, and then thatching material usually or commonly out of peely grass. So then in 1778, Captain James Cook arrived in the islands, and that initial Western contact started to a period of great change. And eventually the building construction and techniques and styles changed, the look and the use of different buildings, and eventually the disappearance of those traditional buildings from the landscape. So from about the early 1800s, we have whalers, missionaries, business people, they all start entering Hawaii. It was a convenient stopping point, a place for provisioning between North America, South America, China, Asia. So as these newcomers begin settling in Hawaii, they bring their new building techniques, their cultural values. And at this point, this was highly influenced by the whaling industry, which brought ship carpenters to Lahaina, especially, as well as Honolulu. And this concept of wood joinery was introduced to the islands as well. The first missionaries arrived in Hawaii in 1820. King Liholiho agreed to allow the missionaries to stay, provided that one be assigned to Kailua Kona and another to Honolulu. And they introduced new building materials. The two most significant was the introduction of mortar and of iron nails. So Mokuaikawa Church was one of the early uses of mortar. This land was near the harbor, and Reverend Thurston directed that the building be constructed. First, it was a large thatched roof structure, but two of those different buildings were destroyed by fire. So this 1835 permanent building began, and the church was completed in 1837. The early missionaries also brought wood construction using iron nails and bracketing systems. And those first frame houses used a style derived from congregational meeting houses and farmhouse vernacular buildings from New England. They were simple with high-pitched roofs, overlapping weatherboards called clapboards. The simplicity was derived from those Puritan ideals, and plainness was a virtue. And then over years, that New England style morphed into a distinctive style called Hawaiian mission architecture, where those methods and materials were eventually replaced by those that were readily available here in Hawaii. So that became what was known as the Hawaiian transitional style. It's where these Hawaiian architectural forms started incorporating Western elements, and the hipped roofs began replacing the simple gable roofs. Windows and doors started to be incorporated. The lanai, which used to be a separate building, now became incorporated into the main building, sort of as a Western porch. Thatching was used for quite a long time, actually, but with traditional timber framing. But by early 20th century, so there were fire codes because, you know, it burns. And so fire codes eliminated the thatch in the urban areas. And really, they stopped being used by about the 1920s, even in rural areas. The knowledge of thatch and weaving also started to disappear. It's sort of having a renaissance now with Kumu teaching it to other generations, but a lot of the materials are no longer being cultivated. So even if the knowledge is there, the materials aren't necessarily. And then another factor that led to the decline in this style were introduction of bugs. So mosquitoes and centipedes and scorpions like to live in those lava rock floors and the thatch and the lauhala mats, and that was incredibly uncomfortable. So it went out of style. But looking at some of that transitional style, again, very few left, but they incorporated elements of both indigenous architecture and this Western influence with the thatch on a timber frame, the hip roof form, Western windows and doors, and covered porches. Plantation style is sort of a catch-all phrase that incorporates this really predominant kind of housing and an urban development, really. But it started as labor housing for the sugar and pineapple plantations. Most of it was adapted from the southern US, some influences from India as well, but then it was altered due to availability of materials and differences in the climate. Many of the design elements are localized. You know, you can tell different styles from different islands or even different plantations around the same island. But during the 19th century, the first housing type was barracks. It was very common for the men who had immigrated to work on these plantations. But single family housing started to develop by the 1890s as women started entering Hawaii, and then families needed to be accommodated. And then it really took off following the 1920s labor unrest. And it was part of the housing reform to deal with some of the labor reform and issues in these plantations. So housing and improved housing really became a priority, especially going into the 1930s. Another major influence was the large immigrant population from Japan. And it's estimated that by about 1950, about 75% of all carpenters in Hawaii were of Japanese origin. And this related to the fact that skilled craftsmen were paid higher wages on the plantations. So there was this incentive for skilled carpenters and other laborers to immigrate. And so they brought their knowledge of joinery and construction techniques and especially carpentry with them. And then that became a big part of the construction. So this character defining feature of this style tends to be single wall, tongue and groove walls, sheltered by hipped roofs, overhanging eaves. Windows were enlarged to improve the ventilation. Kitchens were placed inside the house instead of being outside. And this economical form was used not only on the plantations, but also in urban areas. It really became so prevalent and pervasive that when people talk about Hawaii vernacular architecture, this is what they mean. By about the 1920s and 30s, there was this exploration of an appropriate design for Hawaii. And that's when we started to get some high design, high style named architects. And some of our most notable works in Hawaii date from this period. And in addition to addressing the needs of the climate and what would be appropriate in terms of shade and ventilation, they also started to draw from all of those earlier influences. So the indigenous Native Hawaiian architecture, the missionary paths, the Asian influences, and they start to develop what was known as the Hawaii regional style. And so some of these examples are, the most beloved places in Hawaii today, but the greater accessibility to the outdoors is emphasized. It's during this period that the first landscape architects appear. So we start to see local building materials that were consciously used to accentuate the building's connection to the land and that indoor-outdoor relationship. So some of the common features here became that double pitch hip roof. It's sometimes called the Dickey roof because he popularized this style. The lanai was very popular and is still very much a part of the design today. Casement windows, exterior sliding doors to take advantage of the trade winds and orientation to the climate. Lots of lava rock foundations, and then also some screens for ventilation and privacy while still letting the air flow through. After World War II, this exploration of the appropriate regional design continued, but at this point it became focused on the modern style that was very popular and both internationally and on the continent. But in Hawaii, they really wanted to incorporate something that worked for the climate here. But this was also influenced by the bid for statehood. So wanting to emphasize this kind of relationship with corporate America as well. And so in this example, this is the IBM headquarters in Kaka'ako. And so they wanted something that is modern, something that is of Hawaii and that is specific, but also is a statement about their corporation. So the architects and the engineers at this time were working within the overall vocabulary of the modern movement, but they also were compelled by Hawaii's culture and history, and they wanted to incorporate some of those elements as well. So they developed distinctive forms that incorporated the Hawaiian atmosphere within this modern context. So some of the elements here, the surface remains of primary importance. They have highly textured buildings that were characterized, especially in the 1950s, lots of lava rock, sandstone, coral veneers, and natural materials that were grounding to the land, but lots of variety, contrasting materials that differentiate a facade. Not a lot of decorative ornamentation, unlike the 1920s and 30s with that more elaborate approach. Looking at expressed or exposed structure, really having that indoor-outdoor flow. Sometimes it's not clear if you're inside or outside, is kind of fuzzy. So having terraces and lanais and covered porches, and that variety of materials and textures as well. We also started to see the emergence of prefabricated components, or this assembly line, or this regimented kind of regular construction in prefab components to put it all together. And then beginning in about the late 1980s or so, kind of a postmodern period, Hawaii's architects started to return to an exploration, again, similar to what the architects of the 20s and 30s were doing, a revival of the new forms that incorporated Native Hawaiian design elements and local materials. But unlike that earlier period, these got a lot bigger. So the scale changed, the modular approach kind of changed, and much of the materials are surface treatment rather than structural. So things like the woodwork and interior finishes were brought in from Indonesia and the Philippines. And so this is something that, we can spend a lot of time on looking at, but it's still kind of new to us. So it's a little harder to have some perspective on it. But the high-pitched copper or green tile roofs are pretty common, stucco or rock exterior walls, interior accents, things like ohia and koa, or again, those imported woods, stone and tile floors, vaulted ceilings were pretty common. So as we move forward to today, we don't really have the perspective that comes with time. And so it's hard to really characterize what the current architectural design is. But at least in the urban areas, we're seeing a lot of emphasis on high density, large scale developments, often using super blocks, lots of structured parking, very high density lot line to lot line coverage. So that indoor outdoor relationship is severed. There's not a lot of the relationship to the natural world. It's very much enclosed. Things like air conditioning have changed that. And that's true for mixed use, whether it's housing, office, resort. So the designs will vary, but there's often glass cladding on towers that are stacked on kind of large parking podiums, sometimes with a retail wrap. There's parking and mechanical systems that use a lot of visual screening, things like large murals or green walls or applied artwork kind of things. But we are seeing also contemporary designers that are seeking to include things like energy and water efficiencies. So even though they're severed from the natural world, they are looking at some of those efficiencies of systems. So that really is Hawaii's architectural history over the last 800 years in 5 minutes. But I think it's helpful to think about what are some of those characteristics that we see. So with that, I'm going to invite Andrea and Elaine to come back. And Andrea, you're going to share some of the questions with us, right?
I would love to. I'm encouraging people in the audience to post questions in the chat. And so far, I have not seen any. So maybe we can start out while people are thinking about what they've just seen and heard, and start out with something. I'm just wondering, for either you, Elaine, or Kirsten, if can something be character defining if it was built later? So if there were additions or different phases of history where there were changes to a property.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, am I on mute or did I unmute myself?
Oh, you're fine.
Okay. When you're looking at a property, and sometimes it isn't always clear whether something is newer, right? Sometimes it's obvious and sometimes it's not. You obviously would want to note the presence of that feature or that element or that addition, because it is present. But as you go forward, after you've identified that feature, if you don't know whether it's historic or whether it's later, or even if it's later, whether it's significant, you have to start really looking at that knowledge piece of the building. What is the history of the property? Why is it significant? Is that element or that addition significant as well? Maybe not for the one reason that you think your property is significant, but maybe for another reason. Let's say you have a property that is significant for architecture, but then there was an addition and something historically significant happened within that, addition to the building or something like that. So you would want to note it. You'd want to describe it. You sometimes when you move closer, you can start to discern more clearly, how it was added, even sometimes when you start to look at the materials, if you don't already know when the addition occurred. And so when you have all of that information and then you are trying to decide how are you going to care for this property? Are you trying to preserve it? In which case, you're basically keeping what's there as it is, maintaining it, etc. Are you going to rehabilitate it for another purpose? At which point, if there's an addition or something that's not character defining, or I shouldn't say, not character defining within the period of significance, maybe that's an area that if you have to do something to that building or that landscape, that you work in that area so to minimize impact to other character defining features of that landscape or building. And I'll stop there for a minute instead of rambling on more.
Well, I'll just add that, change over time is part of the history of a place. And so a lot of this documentation is looking at what happened at different points in time. So the Kalaupapa example, I think, is really interesting because it covers 150 years of history and of the Hansen's disease. Obviously, there's an older history than that, but being able to say, well, this is what happened in 1850s, this is what happened in 1880s, this is what happened in 1920s, and they can all contribute to the significance of the place and all be important, but they aren't the same. And so understanding that and the relationship to time, I think also gives it a deeper and richer understanding of not only what's there, but what to keep and how to make those decisions about change.
Thank you so much. I've just been notified that for some reason the chat has been disabled. I was wondering why. Yeah, I was wondering why everybody was so quiet. It's so unlike our audiences. I've enabled people to raise their hand because I can't figure out at this moment how to enable the chat. So if you have a question, and I just ask that you keep it on point, and if you want to raise your hand, I can call on you and allow you to ask the question. And while people are hopefully doing that, let me just pose one more question in the meantime, since we have plenty of time, for either Elaine or Kirsten. And this is, what role, if any, does the condition of a property or features make in whether it is considered character defining? Is that important?
Do you want to go first, Kirsten, or do you want me to?
Well, I'll give the easy answer and then you can give the harder answer. How's that? Condition is something people always key in on, right? They look at it and say, oh, that's eaten by a termite, or that's broken in some way, or it might be degraded in some way. For purposes of whether or not it's character defining, it doesn't matter. Condition is a separate thing. And yet it's really hard kind of conceptually to think about them as separate things. You know, you want to say, well, if that board, for example, is broken, does it contribute to the character? Well, you know, you can still describe that the siding or the construction technique or the material or the design, and note that it has some holes in it, or it needs to be repainted, or that there's a condition issue that should be addressed. But they're not the same. Don't conflate them. So that's my short answer. Elaine, you probably have a more in-depth answer.
No. I mean, you've answered it pretty thoroughly. And I think, you know, if you note the condition of that feature, whatever it is, large or small, that information will help you determine, you know, the treatment of that feature. Does it need to be replaced? Does it need to be, you know, repaired? I think one of the images I had was of a window sash that was laying on the table and that was being repaired. It had termite damage, but they put some composite material in it, even though the window had damage and was inoperable at the time because of that damage. They decided that the approach was to repair it.
Yeah. I'll also note, and then it looks like we are getting some questions, but we were working with the Grove Farm Homestead Museum on Kauai a few years ago. They were doing a restoration project. Now, this is a home museum, you know, so they're trying to interpret it to a particular point in time and talk about the activities that this museum at a particular period in time. So they had chosen the restoration treatment, and they had a corrugated roof, a metal roof that was rusted and corroded and needed to be replaced. And they took extraordinary steps to document the existing roof. So the size of the swales, the depth and the dimension, the type of nails, because they used the square head nails, you know, it wasn't bolted in, it was nailed in, because that's how it was done at the time. They couldn't find a contemporary match. And so they actually had it fabricated to match the historic condition. Now, not everyone doing this is going to have a museum. You know, the museum standards tend to be much higher than, you know, just your personal home or grandma's house. But the fact that they documented that so thoroughly, and they had swatches and examples and sample boards from the original construction period, really helped them as well. So I think that was a example of where that documentation and research and really understanding what is the characteristic. And it's a very simple material. It's a corrugated roof, but it was important.
And I'll just add to that, Kirsten, that, and that level of documentation is very important if you are doing kind of like a reconstruction even of a feature, an element. If you really are trying to reconstruct it, you need that level of detail. And you do sometimes run into materials not being available anymore today, or a particular profile, not only with like things like corrugated metal, but even wood profiles. A lot of them are no longer milled.
Thank you both for that. Max Gunther, I'm going to allow you to talk. Please ask your question. Max? Hello?
I think he's muted.
Max, you have to unmute.
Thank you. How would you evaluate the Polynesian architecture from, say, the mid-century? I'm thinking of, the marketplaces, the old hotels, maybe I think Coco's restaurant in Waikiki, and, some of the sort of nostalgic Trader Vic's, some of that kind of feeling. How would you evaluate that in terms of its historical significance?
Yeah, Max, thanks for that question. So Elaine, I can go first, right? So it's a multi-part question. One is what we're talking about today, which is the character. How do you describe the appearance or the design or the construction methodologies or the materials? And that's exactly the same methodology and framework that was laid out. You look at it from afar and then closer up and then interiors and describe it and look for commonalities. And there's a lot of really interesting research that's been done about mid-century modern design, including a context study that Historic Hawaii Foundation published that looked at that period from about 1940 to about 1970. So that's just to describe it. But I think your deeper question is it significant, and what is its role in history, whether it's association with the 20th century and the development and activities in Hawaii from that time, as well as its relationship to Hawaii, and what does it say about the culture and the economy and the relationships in Hawaii at that time. So the interesting thing about historic preservation is it's easier to look back and understand something than to understand something when you're in the middle of it. And so the farther in time we get and we have that perspective, I think the more we can see and understand and analyze. But the perspective of time makes it easier to understand something from, say, the 1950s than, say, the 1990s. We're still pretty close to the 1990s or the turn of the century. But it's the same methodology. Is there something to be learned about historic events or trends or design or people? And, that was a very rich period of time in, the world. I mean, the post-war period and the jet age and statehood and everything that was happening in Hawaii at the time was a period of immense change. So there's a lot to be learned from that. So Elaine, I don't
have anything to add. I mean, it's a different process because it's an evaluative process. You are evaluating the significance of the resource. And as part of that, you obviously are documenting, but you need that research and that larger context to evaluate whether the property is significant under any of those categories that Kirsten just mentioned.
Thank you. Thank you, Kirsten and Elaine and Max. Sharon Hayden, I'm going to unmute you and you can ask your question.
Thank you kindly. Aloha, everyone. I'm with the Bond Memorial Library Restoration Project, and thank you for featuring us. That was fun. Because of this building having an interior that's Tudor, I tried to look up what did Tudor have to do with Hawaii. And they featured about 13 homes in Honolulu that were Tudor exteriors. It's kind of an odd thing, to have. I don't know of any other place on the Big Island that's like that, you know. So they don't show any of the interiors of the other homes. So I wonder if the interiors of those homes, I think one of them's even become a museum, if I'm not mistaken. And how did that happen? Who brought that little movement in?
I'll let Kirsten answer that.
You know,
Thank you.
Sharon, I just want to say what a wonderful job you and your group are doing with the Bond Memorial Library. It's so exciting to see that move forward. So the kind of Tudor revival, you're right, the Manoa Heritage Center and the Kuali'i House, which is the cook's home in Manoa, is, I think, probably the one you're thinking of as one of those Tudor revival examples. And then there is a historic district that's sort of at the base of Diamond Head that has, I don't know, 6 or 7 examples. I actually don't know how they got here and why they started, but that's the wonderful thing about having these National Register nomination forms. So if we pulled that up, and this is on our website, Andrew, if you, or Michelle, if you have a chance, you can drop the link to our historic properties pages. The process of researching to put a property on the Hawaii or National Register of Historic Places looks at those things. You know, who built them? Why did they build them? What were some of those architectural styles? So I'm sorry, I don't know off the top of my head, but I will say I'm grateful that they're on the register because we can research it and find it. And I wouldn't have thought of the interior of the Bond Library as being described as Tudor. So, but you know, you might be thinking of like the half timbering and the contrast between light and dark surfaces. I think people are just, sometimes they just liked it. You know, it was their personal aesthetic. And they're like, this is fun. And I've seen this other places. And let's do that. I mean, that's how I decorate. So Elaine, what are your thoughts?
I don't know the answer. I mean, it could be as serendipitous of what you just said, Kirsten, just personal preference. I've only seen the exterior. When we were there, I didn't go into the building, so I don't have a visual to go with it. But I do think it's an interesting question. I'm curious whether you have the original drawings for the building, whether that tells you anything, whether the interior was fully designed out, and I'm just curious, but maybe, I don't know.
Our next question is from William Anenson. If you would ask your question, William, I think you have to unmute. There you go.
Kirsten, you folks, that was a marvelous presentation. I really, really enjoyed it. You know, this is sort of maybe a departure from your presentation, but I just was wondering what the criteria for establishing a condition of demolition by neglect, and maybe what the process for determining, you know, demolition by neglect, and what the outcomes could be when you establish a condition of demolition by neglect versus preservation.
Yeah. No, thank you, Bill. I thank you for being here and for bringing that up. And it's not necessarily related to what we were presenting as far as the character defining features, but it does get to treatment and choosing to preserve versus choosing not to. And, you know, one of the things I talk about with anyone who will listen to me is, you know, preservation is a choice. It's not something that kind of happens. There's entropy. You know, we've got gravity and tsunamis and earthquakes and termites and bulldozers, and there's kind of all this pressure. But demolition by neglect is basically a catch-all phrase of ignoring something until it falls down, you know, not intervening in a timely way with maintenance. And that can be something like tenting for termites, or repairing leaks, making sure, you know, the roof is weather tight so you don't have leaks, or if you know, if there's damage, just leaving it, not letting it, not repairing it. So it's pretty much what you'd imagine. You're neglecting a place until it can't sustain itself anymore, and then it starts to fall down. And one of the things I really get annoyed with, and this is me just going off on my tangent a little bit, but when people start to tell me, well, it's too expensive, or it's too hard, or they can't repair or preserve or protect something, when in fact they created the conditions that got it there in the first place. You know, they didn't do the maintenance, they didn't do the repair, they didn't take care of it in a timely way. And that's really what people mean when they say demolition by neglect. It's neglecting a place until it's falling apart. And it's bad. Don't do that. Elaine?
Nothing to add.
Sorry, I should let you go first on some of these. Sorry.
You know me.
I'm hoping there's some other questions for those people who might be shy and only want to put it in the chat. I promise we're kind, and you may think what you're asking maybe is simple or obvious, but I'll bet it's not. And I'll bet there's others who have a similar question who are thinking the same thing. And okay, there you go, Hooper. I'm sorry, I don't know your first name. It just says Hooper. I'm going to open the mic for you. So please ask your question. You have to unmute. There you
Yes,
go.
here I am. Hi. I'm here in Kalaupapa National Historical Park and have some questions. I think one of the questions was like there are many phases of buildings here, like several years, like 1800s to the present, and it's interesting, like how you just said, like when we see buildings fall down and we don't have, like, we can't touch them or break them or, remove it. I'm just talking about removing things that will never be repaired. I get stuck on that kind when we just see them like boarded up and left to, I don't know, fall to nothing, I guess. And my question is, how do you approach things like that? When we get an answer of just put some boards up and let them hang up there and see when it falls, it falls. I mean, I'm just asking that question. What do you do when we get to that point? Because there's several of our buildings are like that right now, propped up and just hanging there to whatever. I don't know what's going to take them down. But, in our culture of Hawaiian, if we don't use things, it becomes trash to us, so having it there, sitting there, not useful and taking up space. I understand it could be historic, but we're just going to let it sit and like break down. And how do we remove the pieces when it's on the ground? What is the process?
Thank you, Hooper. Elaine or Kirsten.
Yeah, I mean, this is complicated for a couple different reasons. So I'm going to go back just a little bit and then come to the last question that you asked. I think with historic properties where there may not be the means or whatever to fully preserve or rehab a historic resource, there are ways to stabilize or to mothball them so that they will potentially last longer than if they aren't done properly. That allow the ways to mothball them, that you board it up so that the building can breathe, so that things are stabilized and you do pest management. But then, if you have resources that are to the point of that they've collapsed, some of the questions are, is it collapsed and there's nothing to salvage there? You can use there any way to salvage and rebuild it. There's lots of different kind of basic questions there as to what is the treatment. Is it completely gone? And then as far as the debris removal, since this is at Kalaupapa, that would be something that would need consultation as to what needs to occur, because I'm assuming it's one of the historic buildings, because it's a historic resource. And so there would need to be some further consultation with SHPD as to what would be the appropriate steps forward. And you could also get input from historical architects and other folks as to whether there's anything salvageable there. And how you might document what is there. Often there's a documentation. Kirsten?
I appreciate the question because well, for a lot of reasons actually, but just to add, not so much on Kalaupapa specifically or any individual example, but more broadly, as a concept. You're not going to be able to save everything. And so this is where the evaluation comes in of both significance, is this a one of a kind, very significant property, like say Washington Place, where if it's gone, there is nothing else like it? Or is it something that is, a tract home that's 50 years old, but hey, there's thousands of them and millions of them across the world. And, maybe that tract home is where, Steve Jobs invented the personal computer that changed the 20th century, in which case maybe that's more important than one that's, just in suburban Cleveland. So, there's that evaluation of significance and how important is it? And that has to relate to the decisions you make. So I wouldn't want to say, well, yeah, once it falls down, let it go. I mean, maybe it is the very last Hawaiian Hale and should be moved to Hawaiian Hale Bishop Museum. Maybe it was once common and ubiquitous, and now it's just the last of its kind. So I hate to kind of give a general answer when maybe it's more complex than that. But there will be cases where either deconstruction or salvage and reuse or just documentation before it's gone, maybe that's the best you can do given the resources you have.
And on the point of documentation, Kirsten, when a resource is, you see it deteriorating, it can be very important to document it at that time before it falls down, so that you do have the necessary information that you would need either to capture it just for historical record, or if you were going to have an opportunity to rebuild it or restore it or reconstruct it.
Yeah.
Thank you for the question and responses. Next, we have Pamela Ross. Pamela, you can unmute yourself and please ask your question.
Thank you. I'm connected with the preservation of the Butcher Estate in Kailua, which is in a very bad state of repair. And the worst part of that estate, we have now discovered, is not part of the original house. It's has mimicked the roof line. So on initial looking at the place, it looks like it's part of the original house. But if you really look at it, the roof joists and the trusses are a very different size from the rest of the house. And while there has been no restoration or very little work done on the property in 50 years, it's probably going to be a really difficult sell to get the owners to take that part down. Should we take it down? They did a lot to mimic how the original structure was built. But since this is the only part of the house that is actually falling down, the construction wasn't the same. They didn't use the same methods and techniques, I would think. So that's our question. That's my question. And I know it's going to be a difficult sell. I'm willing to take up the argument, but should I?
I'll let Kirsten answer that question first.
Again, I don't want to say do X, Y, or Z on this particular case, but I will take it back a step and think about how to think about it, right?
Okay.
And that does get back to looking at change over time. And I think often we think that original is the only part that's historic, and that's not necessarily true. You know, there, especially on properties that have had a lot of change or evolution over time. So just because it was later period does not necessarily mean it's not historic or it doesn't contribute to the character of the place. And that's where this assessment really matters. When you start to say, okay, this is later period and here's how we know, and here's the differences that we're seeing. So first you need to understand it. Then the evaluation is it working? You know, does it fit the needs? Is it in bad condition? Does it support the use that's being proposed now? Is it causing harm in some way? So at least you can make an informed decision on whether it should be kept or removed or repaired or so forth. So it's not as easy as saying, well, that's original and we keep it, and that's later period and we don't. You know, there is an evaluative process that has to go into that decision making. Now that said, if it's causing harm to the rest of it, like maybe the join where the roof lines come together is leaking or collapsing and, you know, the weight is pulling it down, yeah, you might have to make the decision that the lesser kind of subordinate piece of the building is less important than the rest of it, and that decision would be to remove it. But again, I couldn't say on the Betcher estate what the right outcome will be, just that there needs to be a method and a deliberative process, and not just, hey, let's just go tear it down, you know.
And, you know, there is I don't know the property, but there's also sometimes we look at something that's deteriorated and we think that it has to be demolished or done away with. And sometimes there are possibilities of repair, or, you know, some way of fixing that deteriorated part, if that were the decision that were made. And then, you know, once again, you're looking at, you know, what is the treatment that you're selecting?
Thank you. I think we're almost out of time. I think Hooper may have a follow-up question. Hooper, I'll unmute you. I think you have to unmute yourself. Yeah, there you go. Hello. I'm not sure if you have, oh, I think your internet is a little spotty. Let's try one more time. And if not, I can put my email address in and you can send me an email and we can connect afterwards.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So yeah, my other question is about the island of Molokai too. And basically our main town of Kaunakakai town. It's a historic town. And I have a lot of friends that own businesses there. But you know, a lot of them are trying to renovate their buildings and trying to get up to nowadays speed. And a lot of them had a hard time doing permitting and all these things. And I kind of basically, from my, you know, whatever my knowledge, I'm trying to help a lot of them in the things that they should do and not do. Like, you know, if you're in a historic town, pretty much your face of your building needs to be part of that historic town, which a lot of them wants to change the look of their stores, the look at their windows, the new just setting. And so a business just came to me a couple months ago and I try making the front of your building, because he was not getting past permitting through the whatever. And I said, try make the front of your building kind of look like the shape of the old Western style, you know, the front of your, the old historic look. So he did, he changed his blueprints, whatever, and they finally passed him after years of him trying to get it approved for him to renovate his building. And he also kept several of the main posters in the building. I think that helped him a lot by just doing that. So now there's other businesses like are now telling me the same thing. I'm like, of course, like, I think you need to just stay to the standard of the look of this old Western town, you know, how it was. And, you know, because it's already deemed a historic town, that's where you're going to get stuck if you want to make it more modern, and put modern materials on the face of the building.
Yeah, Hooper, thank you. Thank you for that.
I'm not really sure about.
Your Hooper, your internet's going in and out, but
Yeah.
I think that with historic districts or historic, sometimes there are main streets and things like that, other types of designations, that it's very helpful sometimes when there are design guidelines about what can be done with resources that will still maintain the historic character. And it doesn't mean that you can't touch anything or that you can't modernize, but the advantage of those broader kind of either block or district wide guidelines is that they're based in what is the historic character of that place and what are those elements that contribute to that historic character. And then that allows people to understand what are some of the changes that they could make that might not have as large of an impact. And you could think of many different things, sometimes in historic districts, I'm thinking of some residential districts where, in order to make an addition to a home, and maybe it needs to be set back or stepped back or something like that, or certain materials, it allows change so that people can, still have usable properties, but it doesn't destroy the overall historic character. So that's where the information about what's character defining and significant can feed into helping someone understand how they can manage change.
Thank you. I think I appreciate everyone who has been brave to unmute and ask their questions. And I want to mahalo Kirsten and Elaine for their great responses. You can, I'm not sure, Kirsten, if you want to share the remaining slides. We're just, I'm sad to say we're out of time, but I think it was a rich discussion. And again, apologies for the chat somehow disabling itself without my knowledge. We will share this slideshow as well as the recording on our website, and we'll also follow up with everyone who's registered today. And in these slides, we do have contact information. We also, okay, here we go.
Sorry.
Oh, no worries. We have our contact information. Again, this will be posted on the website. There's some resources that you can take a look at. We always welcome your questions, especially after you've participated and you have some thoughtful questions that may take some time to formulate. We have some upcoming, those resources, and this will be on our website on the event page. We have some upcoming programs in the works. A couple of them are for the new year, which is fast approaching. You can see them on the screen. And then we're also doing a partner event with the Hawaii International Film Festival at the Doris Duke Theater. I think that will also be virtual. They are both ticketed, whether you're in person or virtual, but that's coming up. And I encourage you to sign up for, I forgot to mention before we go, we do have a short course evaluation that comes up afterwards. It's super easy. It's really, really helpful if you can take just a couple of minutes just to kind of charge through that. And just a reminder, if you are with AIA and you want credit, please put your name, your AIA number, and your email in case we need to reach you. In that, it's one of the questions in that after the event survey that's going to pop up. Email me if for some reason the survey doesn't surface for you, but it should. We really appreciate you and your support of these events and of HHF in general. And to continue to support us, you can connect with us if you're not signed up for our e-news. There's different ways to support us on the Join Us page, which is on the screen, also to donate in various ways. And we encourage you to look at that. And you can always reach out to us at memberofhistorichawaii.org. I want to thank again my colleague Michelle Cusick, who has been in the back, behind the scenes, helping to make sure everything goes smoothly. And if there's nothing else, I just want to thank everyone very much for your interest and your great questions, and wish you all a wonderful rest of your week. Mahalo and aloha.